So we're going to be talking about other mechanisms of evolution in this video. We talked about microevolution. We talked about how the average phenotype for populations can shift and change with directional, stabilizing, or disruptive evolution. Now we're going to talk about other mechanisms of evolution. The first one we're going to talk about is gene flow. With gene flow, you have two semi-isolated populations that started to look very, very different from each other. And you can see our population of beetles over here is very dark brown. Over here we have a light tan and kind of a medium brown. And what we're seeing now is that these populations are starting to interbreed and mix. So what we would expect here is that they're going to start to look more homogeneous or more the same. They're going to start looking like each other rather than like two separate populations. And we might lose some genetic variety. Then we have genetic drift. This is where just through random chance we have the loss of some alleles. Here we have a population of frogs. We've got 3 color varieties. We got dark brown, we have kind of an olivey green, and then more of a true green. And just by chance, all of the red-brown frogs die out. And when we look at the second generation, we start to notice that it looks very different than the original population. We've lost that red skin color allele, and now our frog population is all green. So it's drifted away from the original population. That's how I like to remember it, that our population, our gene pool has drifted away from what it looked like originally. Then we have the bottleneck effect. This is one of my favorites because it reminds me of zombie movies, and I love zombie movies. When you think of a zombie movie, you think of like a lot of people dying, and you have these intrepid band of survivors that have to make their way in the world, and they have to reestablish the human race. Kind of the same thing with bottleneck effect. We have a population, something catastrophic happens to that population where we drop down to just a few survivors, and those few survivors have to reestablish the population. And when they do that, that population now looks exclusively like the survivors. And because of that, we've lost some genetic variety in the population. The founder effect results in similar outcomes, but it's more cheerful in the way that it happens. So with the founder effect, what you have is a large population that moves into a new habitat. But not all of the individuals from the original population move to that new place. And so that new place now has a limited gene pool to draw from because it doesn't have all of the variety that the original population had. So they start to look very similar to the organisms that established that habitat. Then we can start looking at biodiversity as it relates to geography. So we can look at biogeography as a way of analyzing how different organisms ended up in different places and how similar species that do similar jobs end up in different places. So if we think about organisms that establish themselves in a certain area, and then that area starts to break apart and they lose contact with members that were originally their neighbors, but now live across a small channel, and then they further break apart and they further break apart, you can see some similar species that have some very wide diversity, and that starts creating special adaptations that those species might take on as they kind of acclimate or adapt to their new space. Those are speciation events. That's one way that we can form a new species, is by the breaking up of land masses, isolating species from being able to reproduce with one another. Other mechanisms that produce evolution, sexual selection is another one. Sexual selection is where females or males of a species want one specific trait, and that trait is what they find attractive, and that's what they breed with. They breed with individuals that have that trait. The most common example, or the one you're probably most familiar with, are peacocks. This tail that's full of these beautiful feathers is a sexually selected trait. Females of the peafowl species, they're called peahens. Peahens find peacocks with large, beautiful, full tails very attractive, and they want to mate with them. So they select for males that have this trait, and they only allow them to breed. There are tons of different examples of sexual selection. There's bowerbirds, birds of paradise, supreme lyrebirds. In the description of this video, I will post some examples of videos of these different birds so you can kind of see them, because they are just awesome. They're just great to watch. They have lots of different characteristics that are just fascinating. So there are two types of sexual selection. There's intra-sexual selection, where you have like physical combat between males of a species. If you think of like rams, like slamming their heads together, that's intra-sexual selection. Intersexual selection is where males display certain traits. So that would be the peacock version of sexual selection. And sexual selection is a very powerful force. It can even override concerns of natural selection. If you think about the peacock's tail, that does not camouflage them against their natural predators. It makes them very visible, but that's what the ladies want. So that's what they're going to produce, because mating is more important necessarily than not being eaten by a tiger. So some other ways that we can establish new species, some ways that keep species from interbreeding, are what we call reproductive barriers. There are four big ones that five. Compatibility and fertility kind of go together. You'll see here in a second. Timing. We have like plants. This is one of the big ones for them because they can't move. So blooming at different times of the year, even just a couple of weeks apart or even just a couple of hours apart, can prevent them from crossbreeding so that they don't produce infertile offspring. Behavior, there's a certain behavior that the organism has to display in order to get to mate. You saw this with like the supreme lyrebird or the bowerbird. Habitat, these species that could live together live in different places, so they never interbreed. So like this situation, you have a lizard that lives in the tree, and you have a lizard that lives here on the ground and climbs up onto the fence occasionally. They're never going to interbreed because they don't live in the same habitat. Then we have compatibility and fertility. So compatibility speaks to the organism's parts just not fitting together, and fertility is about the offspring not being fertile. All right, I'm running out of time, so we'll finish up the last couple of topics in the next video.